Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar towards a low emission and resilient urban development experiences in La Paz, Quito and Lima, organized by CDKN, the Climate and Development Knowledge Network. Thank you for taking the time for joining us. My name is Maria Jose Pacha and I am the Knowledge and Networks Manager for Latin American and the Caribbean for the Climate and Development Knowledge Network. So before we begin, I want to go through some logistics and frequently asked questions. Today's presentation will be recorded and it will be uploaded in our YouTube channel CDKN Network. There are also two options for listening to this session. One is through plugging into your computer and the other via telephone that was provided in your registration message. If you experience audio difficulties in listening to this session, this is because you have too many browsers, windows, or softwares open, so feel free to close these. Questions are very welcome, so please write them in the questions section that you can find in the toolbar on your GoToWebinar screen. We will try to answer as many questions as possible in the time available. We will answer questions at the end of the session. If you have any technical difficulties, please send a chat message to me or my colleague Daniela Contreras, and we will try to sort it out. Please answer polls and surveys during and after the webinar. They help us in understanding more your needs. After this brief introduction of the logistics, I want to hand over to our speakers. And before I will give a brief introduction about them, our presenter is Miguel Rodriguez. He has a master's in environmental and natural resource management, specializing in energy research. He is also an industrial and systems engineer with national and international experience in design, implementation, monitoring, evaluation, and systematization of projects focusing on the environment, poverty reduction, mitigation and adaptation to climate change, forest management, water resources, and energy efficiency. Currently, he is involved in the monitoring and evaluation of the project Footprints in Cities for Environmental Services Consultancy, Servicios Ambientales Sociedad Anónima in Bolivia.
Okay, thank you, Maria Jose, and all the folks at CDKN for the opportunity to present some of the results of the Cities Footprint project. And thank to all the participants for being here. Well, first a little bit of the context. Basically, since 2012, more than half of the world population lives in cities, which generate between 60 and 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions and about 70% of world GDP. In that global context, Latin America is the region with the highest urbanization rate. In 1950, about 41% of the people in the region lived in cities. In 2012, that figure went up to 81%, and it's expected to reach 90% in 2050. This translates into increased pressure over scarce resources and also high levels of poverty in urban and peri-urban areas. If you can please, yes. This also translates into increased vulnerability to climate change impacts, since most of the people in the region are actually concentrated in cities, and in particular Andean cities where we worked. There's a high impact of climate change over water resources due to retreating glaciers and the impacts on the hydrological cycle. So this all results in the necessity to shift towards low carbon and climate resilient development. Next, please. So this is why the Cities Footprint project was conceived in the first place. the three cities where we started working are the capitals of Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia in the Andean region, as I said, with a combined population of about 12 million people, and well, with many similarities and also some particular characteristics which I'm going to go through in the next slide. Next, please. Thank you. So the organization of the project is the following. It's co-financed by CDKN and CAF, the Latin American Development Bank. It's facilitated by Fundación Futuro Latinoamericano, which has its headquarters in Quito, and it's implemented by Servicios Ambientales, this consultancy which I represent. We had the technical assistance of the Water Footprint Network, which is based in the University of Twente in Holland, for the water footprint, and for the carbon footprint we had the technical assessment of Carbon Fuel, which is a network of experts in carbon footprint evaluations, which has a base in Barcelona, Spain. And the main partners and beneficiaries of the project were, of course, the three municipal governments of La Paz, Quito, and Lima. Basically, the project was divided into 5 main stages or objectives, specific objectives. The first of which is to evaluate the carbon and water footprints of the municipal governments of these 3 cities, followed by the evaluation of carbon and water footprints of the cities as territories. So the first one is municipal governments as organizations and the services that they provide to the citizenry. And the second one has a focus on territories and the sectors that compose the cities. Based on this diagnosis, let's say, we develop an action plan for reducing the city footprints. And we implement some pilot projects oriented to reduce footprints as well, and with a very educational and communicational component. And finally, to communicate and diffuse the results. Yes, thank you. For those who are not very familiar with what the water and carbon footprints are, just very briefly mention that the first is an indicator of the appropriation of freshwater resources, which is divided into 3 types of water footprints. The first one is the blue water footprint, which means water that is taken from a basin and that is not returned to the same basin, either because it has been evaporated in industrial processes or incorporated into a product or lost, for example, during distribution. Then the second component is a gray water footprint, which refers to water pollution, but it's not the amount of polluted water that is discharged to a river. Instead, it's the amount of clean, let's say, fresh water that is required by the ecosystem to kind of assimilate the pollutants in an effluent and take the quality of that water to a level that actually meets the requirements of the local norms related to water resources. So, for example, 1 liter of polluted water may require 50 or 100 liters of clean water to assimilate it. So the gray water footprint is the 101 liters required. So and then the third component of the water footprint is the green water footprint, which is referred to surface water or rainwater that is incorporated into biomass, either in agricultural products or in green areas within a city. Then the carbon footprint, I'm sure that everyone is more familiar with this, is simply an indicator of the amount of greenhouse gas emissions generated in a determined period of time. And both water and carbon footprints can be evaluated for a person, for an organization, a sector, a territory, for example, a city or a country or even a continent or globally, and a process or product. So next, please. Thanks. This is this slide shows a very simple scheme of the footprint management cycle that we sort of implemented during this project. So first, we have the diagnostics. As I said, we evaluated the carbon and water footprints in order to know where the cities stand in terms of environmental performance, let's say. Then based on that, which was made for the base year 2012, we make projections. We model scenarios, basically two scenarios for each city, a business as usual scenario and a smart growth scenario. Based on this, we um, do a research about the projects and policies that are currently in place and planned in the cities that could have an impact on reducing the carbon and water footprints, and assess their individual water footprint or footprint reduction potential. And then based on that, we help the cities set targets, which is a process that they do themselves. And lastly, we help implement some of the prioritized projects. So next, please. Right. So in the first stage of this cycle, just this is kind of some of the results that came out of the carbon footprint assessment, where we can see that La Paz, Quito, and Lima have in common that the transport sector is the main component of their carbon footprints. In average, about 47%, about half of the carbon footprints in the three cities comes from the transport sector, and the main greenhouse gas emission sources are diesel and gasoline. And the second most important the residential one, which represents in average about 20% of the carbon footprints of the three cities, mainly due to electricity and also natural gas use. Then next, please. Mm. Okay, in terms of the water footprint, these are also the results where we can see that the residential sector is the main component of the water footprints across the three cities with an average contribution of 87%. So here it's very clear that the residential sector is the main component, and thus the main sector that needs to be tackled or uh, in a way attended. And the water footprint type is mainly gray. 97% of the total water footprint across the three cities is gray water, which also makes an emphasis that there that efforts need to be devoted into treating wastewater. Basically, in La Paz and Quito, basically in La Paz there is no wastewater treatment. In Quito it's very low, and in Lima it doesn't reach even 10% of wastewater treated. So this seems to be, well, this is the main component of the water footprint. Next, please. So this is just a comparative chart where we can see a little bit of the comparisons in terms of magnitude. If we see the gray line where it says total carbon footprint in 1,000 tons of CO2 equivalent, we see that La Paz has about 1,500 tons of CO2 megatons of CO2 equivalent, whereas Quito has about 3.5, no, I'm sorry, this is 5 in the equivalent, about 5 megatons, and Lima has about 15 megatons. So that gives a little bit of an idea of magnitude, the orders of magnitude. But then if you compare that with the population in each city, for example, La Paz has less than 1 million people. Quito has 2.3 million people, and Lima has almost 8.5 million people. Then you can calculate the carbon footprint per capita, where we see, it's interesting to see that actually each person in Quito has a larger carbon footprint per capita than each person in La Paz or in Lima. So, but this needs to be interpreted with caution, because the limits of the evaluation are different in each city depending on the context. In the case of La Paz and Lima, 99% of the population is concentrated in what's considered an urban area, whereas in Quito, of the 2.3 million people, about 1.6 live in an urban area, which is 75%, and the other 25%, which is 600,000 people, almost the population of La Paz, live in the rural area. So it really needs to be considered with caution, as I said. And in the upper part of the graph, you can see, of the chart, you can see mainly the main components of the um, of the carbon footprints in each city. Next, please. Well, we have the same analysis for the water footprint, where we can see that, well, in this case, the water footprint per capita is larger in Lima than in Quito and La Paz, which is reflected also in the total water footprint. So there's really not much to to rescue from here, but just mention that the composition of the water footprints are very different. As you can see in Quito, the green water footprint is larger than in the other cities compared, whereas in Lima the blue water footprint is larger. Next, please. So in the second step of the footprint management cycle, this is an example of a business as usual scenario, basically. And I'm sorry because the names of the sectors are not translated, but I think everyone can understand. Basically, what we do is consider National Statistics Institute's data and other official data from the national and municipal government about GDP projections, about population growth projections, and other factors. And we basically model this scenario where no actions would be taken to reduce the footprint. So this is an example where there would be a 60% increase until 2025. Next, please. Then what we do, as I said before, is to kind of do a research, collect information about the current and planned activities in the city, either from the municipal government, the central government, and other actors such as the private sector or others, and some that are not considered and that we ourselves propose that could be taken into account. In terms of the municipal government's actions, we look at the climate change strategies and also more broadly to development plans and projects. So we take each of these actions, which are categorized by sectors, and we assess the footprint reduction potential of each of these actions. And based on this, we come up with a smart growth scenario. If we can go to the next slide, please. So for example, here we have the reduction potential. This is a qualitative assessment of some of the actions that we collected in a certain city, which are divided into which are showed in terms of their impact, their potential impact that translates into footprint reduction, and their cost, which is it's not shown here, but there's a range for cost and for impact. And for example, we come up with, this is I think from La Paz, with a low cost and a high impact, so it's kind of intense green in the upper left side of the graph, we have conversion to vehicular natural gas. So, for example, this is an action that is already taking place in Bolivia in general and in La Paz in particular, which is an action that is being subsidized by the national government, promoting a shift in the energy matrix towards natural gas, because because Bolivia is very rich in natural gas. So it's subsidized and it's basically free for each person that wants to convert their vehicle. So this is basically for free, and it has a high impact because, as we saw, the transport sector is the main sector. So if everyone would kind of convert their cars into natural gas, then that would have a large impact on the carbon footprint reduction. And there are others uh, for example, in the low cost and medium impact. There are some campaigns related to hybrid vehicles or active transport, and also pedestrian day, which is a day that is kind of car free during the year, which has low impact, but if it's repeated over the years and if it's increased in frequency, then it can have an impact. And there are others such as biogas plants, or revision of technical revisions of vehicles, recycling. There are some local actions. For example, Puma Qatari refers to a bus that is a massive bus that kind of displaces small buses that are run on diesel, some of them. So it has a medium cost and a medium impact. So basically, if we go to the next slide, please. Yes, this is kind of the more quantitative analysis of the actions that form part of this, say, project portfolio that is the action plan. Um, so this is, and I'm sorry because this is not translated either, but this is kind of a ranking of options, in this case for water footprint reduction, where we can see that wastewater treatment plants are, well, all of these actions are compared in terms of the implementation cost, the annual reduction potential, and thus the cost effectiveness as an index. So we can see that there are, for example, wastewater treatment plants for the residential sector that would have a very large reduction potential, but have a very large cost as well. So in terms of the cost effectiveness, maybe doesn't rank as well as other actions such as efficient appliances, for example, retrofitting some of the old buildings in the cities with water efficient appliances, for example. This is kind of the ranking that we come up with, and that helps decision makers prioritize some of the actions. Next, please. So based on the individual assessment of each of the actions that I just showed, we aggregate them and come up with a plausible range of reduction. So for example, this is the smart growth scenario for I think it's La Paz as well, and you can see that this is the water footprint of La Paz. You can see that the residential sector is where most of the reduction can take place, due to also its contribution to the water footprint in the first place, followed by the industrial sector and the commercial sector. So we saw that the projected water footprint could be reduced in about 49 or 50%. So that gives an idea of how ambitious the municipal government can be in setting targets and goals to reduce their carbon footprints in the medium and long term. And just to give a couple examples, shifting to carbon footprint, all this process help the cities to take decisions about setting targets. So for example, La Paz set a target of reducing 7% of their projected emissions by 2018. Quito set a target of 5% of the projected carbon footprint starting in 2019. And Lima is currently in the process of defining, so it's to be disclosed. But even though these figures can seem modest, uh, there is there's usefulness to it, because they're starting to engage in a process that is actually regional and global in terms of setting goals and setting defining actions to reduce their footprint. So we rescue this as very important. Next, please. So finally, the in terms of the implementation stage, um, this whole process allows to, as I said, for decision makers to take informed decisions about the projects that should be prioritized from this project portfolio. Based on this, we asked basically the municipal governments of La Paz, Quito, and Lima to prioritize some of the projects presented in this portfolio, and they prioritized about 2 or 3 per city, for which we made roadmaps. So basically, the roadmaps show the steps necessary to shift from a current situation to a desired situation. We calculate the more detailed costs and savings of each of these actions. Also identify financing sources and mechanisms, some of them very innovative, um, as well as tech suppliers. And we actually facilitate kind of the relationship between potential funders and potential tech suppliers with the municipal government. So we're kind of articulating that relationship. And also we assess some risks and barriers and the enabling factors to overcome these risks and barriers. The prioritized projects in the 3 cities were, in terms of carbon, was efficient public lighting with under an ESCO model. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's basically a model where the municipal governments don't have to invest an upfront cost, and they just pay with the savings to the tech supplier. And in terms of water footprint, it was in La Paz and Quito related to water footprint offset mechanisms, and in Lima related to wastewater treatment plants in the center of Lima. Um, Next, please. So yes, finally, in terms of the impacts, well, in the case of La Paz and Lima for the carbon footprint, it was the first time that they assessed their carbon footprints. For Quito, it was a third or fourth time, and for the water footprint, it was the first time for the 3 cities. So it allowed for the 3 cities to know where they stand and to decide where they want to move. So this we deem very, very important, because the premise of this project is that you cannot manage where you don't measure. So we came up with this first measure, and it allows for further actions to be taken. Then this also allowed for footprints to be included in development planning, not only in climate change planning, but development planning overall. For example, in Quito, the characterization of the environmental situation in the Metropolitan Development Plan 2015-2025 was done using the footprints. And there are indicators and targets and objectives related to footprints. So the footprint language is kind of it's impregnated into the development plan of the city for the next 10 years, which is also happening currently in Lima and La Paz. So this, in a way, is a long-term impact of the process that we initiated. Then it also calls for the active participation of stakeholders, and in that sense, it helps to strengthen current networks of local stakeholders, and it's also participative, transparent, and open. And also for their engagement, because as we saw, the for example, the transport sector, where there are some various actors in each city. In order to find a solution, you need to engage with them. So that's an important step towards finding a solution. Then also we found that well, one of the impacts was that we can kind of build from the bottom up in terms of what the cities can do and then link that to the national process in terms of what is happening towards COP21 in Paris, and in particular the INDCs. We saw that, for example, Lima has about 30% of Peru's population, and also it concentrates most of the GDP, industrial and commercial activity. So whatever Lima does in terms of setting targets to reduce their carbon footprints kind of gives an idea to the national government of the level of ambition that they can actually determine. And that happens in Quito and La Paz as well. So this is a very important impact, I think, in terms of the climate agreement to be subscribed by the end of the year. Also, an important impact is in terms of the articulation of cities in international networks and initiatives. For example, we allowed the cities to report their carbon footprints in the carbon platform, the cities registry, climate registry, managed by ICLEI. Then also to CDP. It was the first time that La Paz and Quito, La Paz and Lima actually were part of the annual report 2014 of cities in Latin America by CDP due to their participation in the Cities Footprint Project. They are also in the process of adhering to the Compact of Mayors as a very the universal broad agreement of subnational actors, and also they're becoming part of the city's footprint network, which we are creating currently. This also an important impact is that it allows the cities to comply with international commitments such as the Mexico City Pact, where they commit to report, to assess and report their greenhouse gas inventories. Also, the project has very strong component on strengthening local capacities, which is aimed at sustainability. So basically, we assess the footprints with the municipal government staff, and we develop tools and have them be familiarized during the process, and also have workshops. And we're also currently linking these tools that we created to the municipal information systems, so that the process of assessing footprints can be automated. And in those terms, it allows to kind of facilitate the process in the future, and have the municipal government see how they can they're progressing towards meeting their targets. Finally, we think that the pilots also created an impact because they were a base for the public policy and for scaling up. I'm not gonna provide much details because I know that I'm running out of time now. But and finally, the communication component also created a large impact because we developed apps for smartphones where people can actually assess their carbon and water footprints individually, and kind of in the spirit of co-responsibility, call for their action also, and inform them how they can reduce their individual footprints, which help to reduce the city's footprints. So if you can, I think that's basically what we wanted to present. Maria Jose, if you can go to the next slide, please.
Okay, well, thank you, Miguel. Very, very interesting, everything you mentioned about the project. Here you have some additional resources. You can learn more in citiesfootprint.com or huelladeciudades.com. That's the Spanish version of the site. Also, we have developed some what we call historias por dentro, or inside stories, where we try to put a detail of every work that we do. And here we have 3 different inside stories, one for each city. They are in Spanish, and you can access them in cdkn.org. You have the synthesis report in English from the citiesfootprint.com website. And apart from that, I want to mention that we have a CDKN newsletter that you can register and you can receive information about our work. Also, we have an archive of webinars in our YouTube channel, and there are some other resources and publications. And you can click on the Spanish option for specific resources for Latin America and the Caribbean region. So great. So we have some questions here. So this is the time for you participants to uh, ask your interesting questions. I have one here, Miguel, that has to do very much with what you said about scaling up, and also if you can tell me which are the challenges that you see when trying to apply this very interesting methodology and implementation mainly in the cities in Latin America. Two or three maybe that you have encountered.
Right. Well, I would say that the main challenges, and this is synthesized in the inside stories that you just mentioned about, Maria Jose, are well, first of all, I think um, the obtention of data, collection of data that is complete and that has the required quality to assess the footprints is one of the main challenges that we encountered. We didn't think at the beginning that it would demand so much time and effort, and that in some cases data wouldn't be available, or wouldn't in some cases even it, it wouldn't even exist. So you have to come up with proxies in order to obtain data and assess the footprints. So I think one of the main challenges was that. Another one was to engage with not only local governments but local stakeholders in general. For example, the private sector, which is a main player in the footprint scenario, let's say in the cities. Um, they won't become engaged unless you kind of quote unquote sell the project from a point of view that actually helps them comply with their own agenda. If it's seen as an additional effort for them, which may not have, a kind of return on investment, then they won't become engaged. And it's very important that they do. So I think it's very important to frame the project in a way that is that helps them, as I said, comply with their own agenda. And well, finally, I would say um, more than a challenge, it's an enabling condition to have an internal champion within the municipal governments, and that can be a person or that can be a unit in particular. And in the cases of the three cities, fortunately, we had these champions, without which the implementation of the project would not have been as smooth as it was. So yeah, I think those are three maybe takeaway points that I would stress.
Okay, great, thank you. So this was my own question, but also very similar to what Patricia asked. We have some questions also related to methodology. So Tom, for instance, asked, why are you using the water required to clean the gray water as its footprint?
Yeah, well, the methodology that we use for the water footprint assessment is Water Footprint Assessment Manual, which was developed by the Water Footprint Network, which, as I said, were our technical assessors for this part of the project. So the methodology in this manual says that in a very simplified way, you need to kind of calculate the amount of water that the ecosystem requires to assimilate the pollutants in the effluents that are put into the rivers. So that is basically part of the methodology as it is described. It's not something that we came up with. Of course, it's important to say that well, as I said, you need to calculate the amount of water that is required to assimilate the pollutants to a level that is consistent with local norms. So, but the local norms in the case of the three cities actually don't allow the effect of dilution to unpollute water, to clean water. So it's basically hypothetical situation. It's an exercise where you just kind of try to come up with the magnitude of the effort of the ecosystem to clean the pollution that is being generated. So it's not actually that you're gonna dilute the water, but just calculate the amount of water that would be needed by the ecosystem.
Okay, thank you. We have two questions related to the carbon footprint. One from Jorge. He would like to know where did you take the methodology to evaluate the carbon footprint for the cities? And Michael is asking whether there is any instrument you use to measure the carbon footprint.
Right. Well, for the first question, the methodology is the universal methodology accepted for carbon footprint assessment in cities, which is the GPC, the Global Protocol for Community Scale Greenhouse Gas Emissions, which was developed by World Resources Institute, C40, and ICLEI. Actually, it's important to mention that the cities of La Paz and Lima participated in a global pilot organized by these institutions with about 35 cities around the globe where the GPC was pilot tested. So this also allowed these cities to become part of a global network. So that's about the methodology. And about the instruments, well, we we basically developed tools which are kind of customized to each city context uh, to calculate the water and the carbon footprints. This is not only for the cities as territories, but also for the municipal governments. And as I said, we're in the process of integrating these tools into the municipal government's information systems so that, for example, the data from the consumption of gasoline or diesel that is actually registered in the municipal information system is just does not need to be input manually by a person, but is basically automated to be part of the footprint calculation process. So yes, we're developing these instruments. We have developed and we're adjusting them with the municipal governments currently.
Great, thank you. There are many questions coming up, so I'm afraid that we won't be able to answer all of them. We will try. About processes, yes, Raquel wants to know how long these processes take from assessing the footprints to the decision-making stage, from your experience.
I'm sorry, Maria Jose, could you please repeat that question?
Yeah, yes, which is how long does it take from identifying the footprint to having a decision made at the policy level from your experience? How long does it
Right.
take?
Okay. Well, it's a difficult question, I guess, to answer because it depends on the context of each city. Um, Luckily, the three cities are very progressive in terms of climate change policies, so it was not hard to kind of present this to high-level decision makers, including the mayors themselves, and to have them understand in a very um, let's say executive way and translate this into actions. To mention a couple examples, in the city of La Paz, when we presented this to the mayor, he decided to come up and publicly present the 10 commitments of the municipal government to reduce its footprints. So that basically the results translated into public policy almost immediately. whereas in the other cities and also in La Paz, but in another context, I think it takes some time to ripple through, let's say, the institutional architecture and kind of um, be materialized as public policy. But as I said before, luckily, um, this these footprint assessments and the portfolios that we came up with, the action plans, are becoming part of some um, let's say urban management instruments such as development plans. So it's a little bit case by case, and I think it's also it needs to be uh, a constant process where you're trying to reach to not only technical staff but also to high level decision makers, which are the ones who give basically the okay to kind of translate this to public policy.
Okay, well, thank you. We have Gabriela that she's asking how to link the subnational with the national level. I think it's still a challenge. How do you think municipalities could use results and impacts of the project to achieve some kind of incidence at the national level? And this also
Right.
is related to a question that is being asked, especially when, for instance, at the national level you have subsidies for fossil fuels, as in Ecuador, for instance. Which is your thought about that?
Right. Yes, I think that is a very relevant question, and one that we have been asking ourselves, and we don't have a definite answer to that. But let me try to come up with some ideas. Um, First, we believe that the national commitments, the intended national uh, commitments in the framework of the UNFCCC should take into account the subnational uh, footprints and the subnational targets to reduce those footprints. Otherwise, we don't see um, how national governments could actually decide their commitments in the long term. We believe this needs to be articulated between both levels. And for this, we believe it's necessary to open the dialogue between these two actors. Unfortunately, in some, well, for example, in Ecuador and Bolivia, the national and the subnational governments are from different political parties. So this represents a barrier to open this dialogue. And even though we think it should be kept in technical terms and not in the political sphere, but still it's a barrier. In the case of Peru, there is more alignment between the government of Lima and the national government, but still there are also difficulties to kind of establish this dialogue. Um, However, I think it gives us some hope. For example, the process that was started by the Environment Ministry in Peru, where they opened a call for contributions at the subnational level, so that the cities in Peru would actually report to the national government what they are doing in terms of reducing their footprints, so that they can um, elaborate an INDC and present it in the UNFCCC. So I think this is a good example of what can be done in order to integrate the subnational and national levels.
Okay, well, thank you. Yes, I think that's a challenge, right? How that can link up. And about the sustainability of this type of initiatives, Gabriel and Jorge are wondering the same thing. How can municipalities sustain these processes, and what strategies can we support them to implement for the sustainability of these kind of initiatives in the long term? And Jorge says something similar. How willing do you think the local governments in Lima, Quito, and La Paz are to continue with this initiative?
Right. Yes, that's also a very relevant question. Thank you. So we believe that in order to make this the process that we initiated sustainable, it needs to be enacted as public policy. So the example I gave about Quito having the footprints, let's say, as part of the metropolitan development plan is actually a very crucial step, because once it becomes part of a long-term municipal plan or metropolitan plan, then it has not only the let's say the general lines towards where the city wants to go, but also it gets financial resources allocated to some of the actions that are proposed in the portfolio. So that helps, of course, build upon the sustainability of the process. Also, um, in terms of the targets, we believe it's an important component, because once the municipal government set a target, then even though it's voluntary and it's not binding, um, not only at the local level but also at the international level, let's say in the carbon repository or CDP or the Compact of Mayors, there is a formal commitment by the municipal governments, and they in a way are held accountable to meeting those targets. So we think that becoming part of these international networks and initiative is also a way to make this process sustainable. And finally, I would say that the the component of local capacities is also crucial. Uh, as long as local staff are have capacities to kind of assess their performance towards meeting reduction targets that, as I said before, are enacted as public policy, then we think that it can be sustainable. Of course, we take into account the fact that for long-term targets, the political cycles are more short-term. In Peru, it's 4 years terms for mayors and their teams. In La Paz, it's 5 or 6, the same as Quito. So we are aware that there is very much of a personal rotation. So that is why we believe that the instruments, the tools for assessing the carbon and water footprints need to be part of the municipal information systems and need to be as automated as possible, so that the reports are basically generated automatically and are given to decision makers in order to, decide how to move forward.
Okay, thank you. Well, we have some questions also in the bottom-up approach of reducing footprint. Is the very local person getting actively involved? How has been the grassroots response, and how successful have you been in using mobile apps in achieving this agenda?
Right. Yes. Well, we believe that that is very important to get the citizens involved. For example, as shown in the water footprint assessment, about 80 between 85 and 95% of the water footprint comes from the residential sector. So that means, every one of us, you, me, and that calls for co-responsibility. So we think people need to be aware of their contribution to the carbon and water footprints of their cities, and also be aware of what they can do about it. For example, there was a poll a couple of years ago here in La Paz where uh, they asked if people are aware of climate change and if they are worried about climate change, and more than 80% of the people said yes. But when it came to knowing about what people can do about it, then not many people know. For example, I don't know, shifting your diet from an omnivorous diet to a vegetarian diet has an impact on the carbon budget of your city and your country. So people are not very much aware of that, and that is why we came up with these apps for smartphones, where we inform people about what they can do in order to contribute to this process of shifting towards low carbon and climate resilient development. And I just want to also stress the fact that um, that for example, in Quito, they initiated this very interesting process that we think it's worthwhile emulating in other cities, where they call for co-responsibility of all the actors, not only the citizens, but the private sector, universities, the ONG, NGOs, etc. And they created under the Metropolitan Development Plan the footprint reduction program, where the municipal government actually created this environmental distinction, so that, for example, companies that actually are assessing their footprints and doing something to reduce their footprints are recognized publicly with a distinction, saying, these guys are doing something to help us, the collective, the let's say the city, to reduce its footprint. So I think this kind of incentives, along with the information that I just mentioned, are something that can be very useful in terms of engaging all the actors within the city.
That's very interesting. I always wonder how these applications are being used as well. So it's great to know that they are going somewhere. So also we have a question from John here saying that apart from the mitigation potential and the costs, did you consider other elements, for instance, social benefits when ranking priority actions?
Um, yeah, that's a good question. We took into account the co-benefits, social, environmental, and economic co-benefits, besides, the implementation cost and the reduction potential of these actions in the portfolio. But for this particular ranking, we did not factor them in. It's they are mentioned as co-benefits of each of the actions, but they're not factored in for this particular ranking.
Thank you. We have some question from Maurice. He says, what are the criteria of a low carbon, resilient, and resource efficient city? And what role has integrated urban planning and design in this? Wow, that's an interesting question.
Mm. Right. I'm sorry, Maria Jose. Can I ask you to please repeat it?
Yeah, what are the criteria for you for a low carbon, resilient, and resource efficient city?
Right. Oh, well,
Wow.
that's a complicated
Maybe
question.
you can just say one or two things that you consider that are key.
Yes. Well, I would say urban mobility would be one, given that transport is the main component of the water of the carbon footprint, and also cities that do something about water pollution are also, in the way, or already climate resilient. I would say taking water as a proxy for adaptation. And I'm sorry, maybe there's not much time to elaborate on that. I would love to respond fully to that, and maybe we can provide my email or something, and I'd be glad to respond
Yeah.
appropriately to that question.
Yeah, what I will do afterwards, because I think that we have more questions that we can answer at the moment. To everyone, that if your question was not answered, we will try to do that after the webinar, and Miguel will have this work to do, extra work to do. So Jimena, she has three questions, but we're going to pick one of them. What criteria did the municipalities use to select priorities for the pilot phase?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question as well. Well, the main criteria was to be what was the footprint reduction potential. So if these actions would have an impact on reducing the carbon and water footprints of the city, and also if there was let's say a strong economic case to it. For example, building a wastewater treatment plant is an investment that does not necessarily have a financial return, whereas replacing replacing the public lighting system with, for example, LED type lighting, it has return on investment. So that was also an important criteria for municipal governments, the economic case to it. There are a couple more, but I would say those two are the main ones.
Well, thank you. So we have some 6 more questions to go, but as I said before, we ran out of time. I think that the last thing I'm asking the participant of this webinar to do is to answer this poll. Whether do you mind if we add you to our e-newsletter mailing list, and you can still receive more information about this project and about others. So you can answer this at this time by selecting yes or no, and we will capture that for our future work. So I want to thank everyone and thank Miguel for the wonderful work he's leading. I know that a lot of people is involved in this,
Yeah.
and I don't know if we want to add something else.
From my side, just wanted to thank you for this opportunity and thank the participants for their relevant questions. As I said before, I would be glad to respond fully to them by email or other means.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us, and look for this space for future webinars coming next month. Thank you.